Good afternoon, and thank you, Michael, and thank you, Socitm and Paul, for inviting me to speak. I must admit, when I first was invited, I struggled a little bit thinking about the relevance, and to be truthful, I wonder whether you're also sitting there and wondering about the relevance that I'm going to speak about. Hopefully, we may find some common points of interest. But actually, when I started thinking about it and thinking about the critical role that information and communication technology and systems plays in a number of things, really, in engaging and reaching with customers of public services and the transformation of those services, then the relevance began to become much clearer to me. And in fact, there are actually some not-for-profit organisations who are fairly important providers in this space, particularly around the fringes, around customer contact and information and advice type of services. As Michael said in his introduction, I'm going to talk very briefly about my role and what I'm trying to achieve alongside colleagues in the Cabinet Office. I'm also then going to talk a little bit about a bit of a pitch, to be honest, which I can't resist when I've got a group of influential commissioners, procurement people and systems experts in a room, about the value that VCSE providers can bring within public services, and that value point is at several stages of the commissioning cycle. And also a little bit about, again alluded to by Michael, how the commissioning process and the procurement process as it stands sometimes creates barriers to VCSE being able to fulfil the value that they can contribute. And then briefly some reflections upon some of the ways around those barriers. And just to finish up, I'll very, very briefly probably talk about some of the Cabinet Office initiatives that I'm involved in trying to enable maximum value to be achieved from the sector. So briefly then, my role, grandly titled Crown Representative for the Voluntary Community and Social Enterprise sector. The last time I'll say that, as Mike mentioned, the acronym of the VCSE, a relatively new one. It's the one that this government likes to use. It's really a replacement in many respects to what we got used to calling the third sector in a previous life. And the role is, I'm working in the Cabinet Office as part of the commercial team. And I think that's an important indicator that the focus of my work is very much seeing VCSE providers as suppliers, as an important supply base for public services. And the role is very much about enabling and opening up that supply base to play a greater part in opening up of the public services market across a very wide range of aspects. It is not about in any way artificially propping up charitable providers because they're charities. It's about viewing VCSE providers as a supply market and trying to find the most efficient way of engaging with and working with that supply market. It's very much linked to, and I understand Mike Bracken touched upon this briefly, it's linked in a way to an ambition to diversify the supply base to public services and avoid a small number of very large providers delivering a very growing proportion of outsourced public services. So it is about diversification. It's also about trying to improve the dialogue between government and the sector with that ambition in mind. And then there's some practicalities around the role, which is it's about trying to make it easier for VCSEs to tender for contracts, removing barriers that exist in the procurement process. I also work with colleagues on the design of particular programmes. I've been working very much the last 6 months with colleagues in the Ministry of Justice who are looking at probation reforms. And I suppose that's an example of where I'm driven, which is to find those areas of public services, particularly where there's reform or transformation, where there's a large and important capacity and capability in the sector that we need to find efficient ways of tapping into in the commissioning process. There's also part of my role, the penultimate minor bullet there, which is trying to improve the sector's capability and capacity to be more effective and more competitive in a public services marketplace. There's some big challenges that VCSE providers face. I shan't go in detail through these numbers, but I think the important one for me is the bar chart on the right there, which shows that just over a decade ago, 4.4 billion to 4.3 billion was the split in public spending that reached the VCSE sector, a split between grant funding and contractual income streams. And just over a decade ago, the slight majority, just over 50% of funding came through grants. Where we are today in the latest figures, that's reversed to about 80%, as you can see the bar on the right there. 80% of public spending that reaches VCSEs comes through the form of contracting. And that's not even taking into account subcontracting, which is also a large proportion of spend with VCSEs. So there's been a real shift in the marketplace, and that presents quite a challenge for a lot of VCSE providers, particularly charities, particularly the smaller to medium-sized charities, who in shorthand really are coming from a background and a culture of being supported through grants to now operating in a marketplace and trying to find subcontracting and contracting opportunities in a competitive marketplace. That definitely presents a big challenge to some of those not-for-profit organisations, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But in terms of why I think it's important, I suppose my guiding light is that that I know, and I see it time and time again, that many of the most effective, most efficient, best value for money, most innovative services are provided by not-for-profit organisations, by VCSE organisations. And particularly when you're trying to reach and serve the most disadvantaged or alienated communities and groups within society, often the most expensive groups to serve through public services, VCSEs often have the best links, the best channels, the best understanding, and very often the best services to reach those citizens. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't get the chance to deliver those services because of the commissioning process may create insurmountable barriers to them to be able to find that role. So I think it's vital that we find ways within this commissioning marketplace to reach those providers. And the reasons why I think it's vital are listed here. I think first and foremost, VCSE providers have an inherent core focus on meeting the needs of the beneficiary, particularly as a charity, and I'm a trustee of a number of charities. Our driver as a corporate organisation is set out in our charitable objects, and that is our mission. So there's no diversion trying to create profit out of that process. We're very purely focused on meeting the needs of beneficiaries. We're legally responsible for that. And if there's a match between that charitable object and the need of a public service commissioner, I think you've got the best buyer-provider match-up that you can possibly get in public services. Underneath that focus on beneficiaries, what VCSEs can provide is real proximity and understanding of users. They can provide channels to the user voice. And I think that VCSEs can also be really well suited to outcome-focused commissioning models because of that needs connection between meeting the needs of beneficiaries. And if that matches the outcome that commissioners try to achieve, you've got a perfect match. Additionally, the not-for-profit nature of VCSEs means that sometimes costs can be taken out of the process, but I also think, perhaps more importantly, there can be a really good cultural fit between the public sector and between the VCSE provider in a more open and transparent and joined-up way than potentially the relationship between public sector commissioner and private provider. VCSEs can also deliver third point there, social action resources, and that can be in the form of volunteering and campaigning and affecting real change in communities. So we've got programs that are often linked with transformation of public services, really trying to change the approach and the attitude of service users as well. VCSEs often have the best angle on that. And now you'll be aware of an obligation in law now for the commissioning of public services over a certain value, EU threshold value, to take account of the social value of that commissioning process since the Public Services Social Value Bill came into law at the beginning of this year. And VCSEs obviously have a natural advantage of being able to demonstrate and deliver that social value and fulfil the commissioner's needs on that point. I've already touched upon the last point, but I think that the social purpose can really forge very effective engagement with the public sector. and flexibility to work in different models. VCSEs are working in mutuals and spin-outs within the public sector, and have that flexibility to be pretty fleet of foot. But there's some issues, as I've mentioned, in the commissioning process that can act as barriers to VCSEs being able to play a full part. The commissioning of public services inevitably is facing those tough fiscal challenges that we're very aware of. And that is sometimes necessarily taking funding away from VCSEs, and that we're seeing a real reduction in grant funding, building upon that the trend that I talked about 2 or 3 slides ago. And that is more and more creating that pressure for VCSEs to be active in a competitive marketplace and to find their way around that marketplace, and that's presenting some challenges. The scale of commissioning is also inherently often large scale. I mean, I often, in my work with commissioners, that's one of my default challenges is, does it need to be at that scale, and is there a lotting strategy that can open up and diversify the potential provider side? But inevitably, often the scale is large, and that creates financial risk. It creates complexity of process for VCSE providers. And linked to that financial risk, it can create real cash flow implications, particularly on payment by results or outcome-focused commissioning models. And VCSEs, particularly charities, have different access to finance than private sector providers, have different rules, different governance structures that they have to operate within that can sometimes limit their access to finance. Commissioning through contracting and indeed subcontracting represents the real change, and a change in the environment for providers. And not only does that create risk, it creates capability gaps as well for VCSE providers. And I've met lots of VCSEs. I used to work for a social enterprise that did a lot of work in the DWP's work programme. You may have read about the experience of some not-for-profit providers in that programme. And they often struggle, but they often struggle through a lack of capability, the lack of understanding what we're getting into, not understanding the obligations and risks that they're entering into in a contract or a subcontract, not understanding the legal framework and the contract management framework that they're operating under. And that's because of that shift from grant to contracting culture and not having the right capabilities to do that. Penultimate point, commissioners often don't understand the VCSE sector sufficiently well, and doing a lot of work to try and improve and to engage. And again, one of my oft mentioned mantras is really important to engage early with this sector and outside of the procurement process. Again, I've touched upon the final point, so I should move on to some of the solutions to overcome those obstacles that I've mentioned there. In terms of the rapid change, I think VCSEs have got a really important part to play in genuine redesign and reform of public services. Through that access to service user voice, through a long track record of finding innovative solutions, particularly to reach the most disadvantaged and often hardest to help clients. So I think if you can bring VCSEs into the design stage, that you can really maximise some of their contribution. And because that innovative culture, the VCSEs are playing a part in lots of different kinds of models, collaborative models, co-commissioning models with public service commissioners, mutuals that I mentioned, and I think that's a real opportunity to overcome some of this change, is to bring VCSEs early into the process. Transparency is another really important point. We're within the Cabinet's office doing an awful lot of work around the earlier publication of commissioning intentions and the standardised use of contracts finders and other portals to give visibility to contracting and commissioning opportunities at the earliest possible stage that can help underpin that good pre-market engagement that I mentioned earlier. We're also doing some work around capacity and capability building within the sector. My final slide, I'll give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we're doing to try and build the sector's capability to meet some of these challenges. In terms of the scale, I've already mentioned lotting strategy. The second point under that main point about scale is a really important one for me, is that I've talked a couple of times about VCSEs being able to play a part through collaborative models, but the commissioning process has to allow for that. And I've often heard commissioners saying, well, we welcome collaborative type models to enable smaller providers to play their part in this service. But actually, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the process, there's barriers built into that process. They can be quite simple things like 3 years of accounts, and when you're operating under a new model, like a collaborative model, that will create obstacles to being able to play a part. And again, in terms of scale, an awful lot of VCSE provision is through subcontracting and supply chain arrangements, and VCSEs are important subcontractors to some of our very, very large commercial providers, Serco, Capita, some of the IT systems integrators. VCSEs playing a part in the supply chains there. But I think good commissioning can set out some obligations, particularly around the integrity of how supply chains work and the visibility of how supply chains work, that can help secure a sustainable role for VCSE providers in those supply chains. And some good examples of where that's happening. The final point there, in terms of the complexity of the process, again, another big drive you may well be aware of within the Centre and in the Cabinet Office and procurement policies to try and simplify the process and to make the process slicker in terms of procurement process. I was involved working with a charity in a bid for the 2011 census, and we were playing a fairly significant part in the delivery of that programme successfully in the end. The resource drain that put upon a reasonably large charity really opened my eyes to how the complexity of the process can really drag a relatively small provider into often unsustainable positions in terms of the amount of effort that needs to be put in. We ended up with a 180-page tender in that, which is part of a much bigger tender, and 4 or 5 people pretty well working on that programme for 9 months. So the demands, those kinds of demands, particularly on charities, are often stretched too far. One other method for overcoming some of these obstacles, and I've talked about this already, but I no apologies for repeating it. Engagement with VCSE in the commissioning process, I think, can really pay dividends and can lead to really effective commissioning. Whenever I talk to VCSE audiences, this is one of my #1 asks. It's don't wait for tender notices. You need to engage with commissioners in your area, understand the landscape of commissioning in your area, talk to commissioners, and come to commissioners with solutions, evidence-backed solutions as to how you can play a part. Very briefly now, so we have some initiatives within government, despite the difficult fiscal times. So there's still some funding available to alleviate some of these issues. There's an investment in contract readiness fund that's run by the Cabinet Office, which provides some support for VCSEs in terms of building up their capability and capacity to deliver. There's a social action fund and the social outcomes fund, which are really geared around social impact type models and models bringing in volunteering resources. I mentioned in terms of capability of the sector, we've created a program called the VCSE Commercial Masterclass, which is a 2-day workshop running across the country for VCSE providers to learn some of the nuts and bolts about how to be effective in this marketplace. And some of you may have come across or may have been involved in the Commissioning Academy, which is run by the Cabinet Office, which is, it's not a how-to commission, it's very much about bringing in commissioners facing opportunity to do things differently and to innovate in commissioning together and to learn from peer-to-peer engagements about really challenging what the norm is in commissioning and thinking about new models, and particularly the relationship with partners like VCSE providers. I've already touched upon some of the other things there, so I shall wrap up there, and if there is time, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks very much. Any questions for Michael? I mean, my first one is, what's your outputs? What results have you had? Do you have any figures for the increasing role of VCSEs since you started this programme?
That's a very good question, and until Saturday, just gone, there was only an independent measurement of VCSE spend within the public sector, which is conducted by an umbrella organisation in the sector called NCBO through a survey, which frankly isn't the most probably accurate or scientific way of doing things. Saturday, as part of the small business announcements that were made, there's now a commitment, particularly at central government level, to measure, alongside SME spend, but also to measure VCSE spend, so we'll at least have a starting point to measure that. But programme by programme, I suppose I mentioned some of the programmes I'm working on. We're looking very much there at how we can increase access to the marketplace for VCSEs, and seeing some successes, but a lot of it's in design stage at the moment. But from now on, there is going to be measures across central government, and there's also a local government through CLG and LGA proposal at the moment to also capture VCSE spend at the local authority level.
Okay. Any questions? I know we have a couple of VCSEs here. Any thoughts? Yeah, the gentleman over here. Like over here?
I do. Thanks. I'm David Clayton from the Socitm. I'm a Socitm non-exec board member from the third sector. I agree with an awful lot of what you have to say. I think some of the issues are cultural between the commissioners and charities, as you've indicated. I think other things are the pure practicalities, short contracts with identifying outcome measures that are sensible but not woolly, that lead to basically long-term outcome change for a short-term intervention, ending up in not full repayment of costs. So I think there's a real danger of charities being seen as low-cost subcontractors rather than colleagues. And I don't know, I think to me that's one of the aspects, one of the limitations that needs to be overcome in addition to the good points you made.
Absolutely, and I think that I talk about a shift from a grant-funded culture to a market contracting culture, and I came across an example just recently of a commissioner. I shan't mention the name, but a commissioner working with a VCSE provider who was winning a contract and had traditionally been funded by grant, but the commissioner was still asking for commitments about reserve levels being maintained by the VCSE provider. Now, I kind of challenge that kind of culture, because you can't expect a provider to shift from grant to contract but then still hold them to the same obligations as you would in a grant culture. And one of my challenges to VCSEs is that actually they need to move beyond that mindset of full cost recovery, which is traditional linked to grant funding, to move more now to pricing, because you're in a commercial setting. You should be pricing your services, and also make no apologies for building in developmental funding into those models as well. But there's an awful lot of work to do there because of that shift, and a lot of cultural issues and capability issues to move from there. But I think it's a really good point.
Thanks very much. I think we need to move on now, so unless there's any pressing points. Thanks very much indeed, Michael.
Thank you.